The Wyoming sun blazed like a furnace in the cloudless sky, turning Clearwater's main street into a corridor of dust and fury. Eloise Harper's wrists bled where coarse rope bit into her flesh as hostile hands shoved her through the jeering mob. Her blue dress, torn and stained with 3 days of hiding in the Badlands, clung to her sweat-soaked body like a second skin. Savage lover. Madge Hartwell's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The woman's face was twisted with the kind of righteous hatred that justified any cruelty. Trading white children for red ones, while decent folks suffer, Eloise stumbled but stayed upright, her mind fixed on the memory that had damned her. 3 nights ago, she'd watched militiamen drag Cheyenne children from their beds, loading them into wagons bound for the slave markets. When she'd seen 6-year-old Running Doe's terrified face in the moonlight, she'd acted without thinking, cutting the girl's bonds and helping her escape into the darkness. The price was everything she'd ever known. "Please," she gasped, her throat raw from dust and thirst. She was just a child. A heathen child. Uncle Jeremiah's weathered face showed no mercy. The man who'd raised her after cholera took her parents, now looked at her with a disgust reserved for vermin. "You chose them over your own blood, over God himself." The crowd surged forward, carrying her toward Clearwater's edge where weathered posts marked the boundary with Cheyenne territory. Beyond lay a world her neighbors saw as inhabited by demons wearing human faces. "This is where you belong," Madge spat, slicing through Eloise's bonds with unnecessary violence. "With the animals you love so much." The rope fell away, and Eloise collapsed on sun-baked earth. Behind her, the mob retreated, their Christian duty complete. Ahead stretched endless prairie shimmering with heat that promised no mercy. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but even God seemed to have abandoned her. Dust clouds on the horizon marked approaching riders. Whether salvation or damnation remained to be seen. The Cheyenne emerged from the heat shimmer like spirits materializing from another realm. Their horses moved with fluid grace across the scorched earth, riders sitting with the confidence of people who belonged to this harsh landscape. Eloise forced herself to stand despite trembling legs, knowing first impressions might mean life or death. The lead rider was a woman of perhaps 50, summer silver-streaked hair, braided with hawk feathers. Her weathered face held the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear. "You are the white woman who freed Running Doe from the slave traders." "Yes." The word came out as a croak. "I couldn't watch them take her. And now your people cast you out for this mercy." The woman's dark eyes held depths of understanding born from similar betrayals. "I am Ayanna. Why come to us instead of seeking another white settlement? Because there's nowhere else?" Eloise's voice grew stronger. "They'll never forgive what I've done. In their eyes, I'm already lost." Murmurs rippled through the gathered Cheyenne. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion. A scarred warrior rested his hand on his knife handle with obvious intent. "She brings soldiers," the warrior said in accented English. "White women mean war parties and broken treaties." "Soldiers come regardless, Dakota," said a quiet voice from the group's edge. "They need no excuses beyond their own greed." The speaker sat apart on a paint horse that stood unusually still. At first glance, he appeared to be just another warrior. But Eloise noticed how his left leg hung differently, how he favored his right side when shifting. His face seemed younger than his bearing suggested, perhaps 30 winters with intelligent eyes that cataloged everything. "You speak for her, Chaska." Dakota's tone carried challenge. "I speak for what's right. She risked everything to save one of our children. That earns consideration." Consideration, yes," Ayanna said carefully. "But consideration and acceptance are different things. We have suffered much from white treachery. I know what my people have done to yours." Eloise stepped forward, ignoring hands that moved toward weapons. "I've seen the burned villages, the broken promises. But I also saw children being sold like cattle 3 nights ago while my neighbors counted money. I couldn't be part of that." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I don't ask for charity. Let me work for my place here. Let me earn whatever acceptance I can." Chaska dismounted with obvious care, his injured leg making the movement awkward. On the ground, his limp was pronounced, but didn't seem to slow him. "I offer her shelter, if she proves worthy of it." The discussion that followed was rapid Cheyenne, too fast for Eloise to follow. Voices rose and fell in passionate argument while she stood in blazing sun, her fate being decided by strangers with every reason to hate her. Finally, Ayana raised her hand for silence. "The council will consider this tonight. Until then, you may stay. But understand, we are not your people, and this is not your home. You must earn both through deeds, not words." As the group dispersed, Chaska approached with his careful gait. Up close, she could see his injury was old, the left leg badly broken and healed crooked, ending his warrior career. "Why?" she asked. "Why speak for me when you don't know me?" His dark eyes studied her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Because I know what it feels like to be cast aside by your own people. Judged useless for something beyond your control. Your leg, among other things." He gestured toward the distant camp where smoke rose from cooking fires. "Come. If you're going to survive here, you need to understand what you've chosen." The Cheyenne camp sprawled across a natural depression beside a sluggish stream, offering some protection from endless prairie wind. Teepees stood in careful patterns, their buffalo hide walls bleached pale by relentless sun. Children played between lodges, while women worked with economical, purposeful movements. It was beautiful in its alien way, but Eloise could see signs of hardship. The stream ran low, speaking of drought. Horses were thinner than they should be, and too many faces bore the hollow look of people rationing hope with food. "White settlers' cattle have overgrazed the eastern ranges," Chaska explained, following her gaze. "Buffalo herds move farther north each year, chasing grass that still grows. We survive, but it grows harder each season." A woman emerged from a nearby teepee movement, sharp with barely controlled anger. Scars crossed her left cheek like pale lightning, and her dark eyes held pain that never fully healed. Seeing Eloise, her expression hardened further. "So this is the white woman who thinks she can live among us," the woman said in heavily accented English. "I am Tali. These scars are gifts from your soldiers given when they burned my family alive." The words hit Eloise like physical blows. She'd heard stories of military raids on peaceful villages, but seeing evidence written in scar tissue made them real. "I'm sorry," she began, but Tali cut her off sharply. "Sorry is a word. Words cost nothing. If you stay, you will work. Hard work that will break you if you are weak. And if you prove spy or fool, I will kill you myself." "Tali," Chaska said quietly, but the scarred woman was already walking away. "She means it," he said after Tali disappeared. "Her husband and 2 children died at Sand Creek 5 years ago. She has no patience for white promises." "I understand." Eloise straightened despite exhaustion. "What kind of work?" "The water to start. The stream is nearly dry, but there's a spring 2 miles north. 4 trips daily every day. The buckets are heavy, the sun is hot, the way is rough. Think you can manage?" Looking at the endless expanse of sun-scorched prairie, Eloise felt her resolve waver momentarily. Then she thought of Running Doe's terrified face, of the choice that brought her here, of the fact that there was literally nowhere else in the world she could go. "I'll manage." Water carrying began before dawn. Tali thrust a wooden bucket into Eloise's soft hands, without ceremony pointing toward the distant rise where the spring supposedly lay. The bucket felt impossibly heavy, even empty its rough wood immediately raising blisters. The walk became a daily odyssey of endurance. Under the merciless sun, each step felt like walking through molten glass. The spring was little more than a seep in rocks, barely producing enough water to fill a bucket. By the time she returned to camp, her clothes were soaked with sweat and her vision blurred with exhaustion. Again, Tali would say without sympathy. By the fourth trip, Eloise's legs shook and her back screamed with each step. She collapsed beside the cooking fire, gasping for breath that felt like swallowing flame. Cheyenne women watched without comment, their faces revealing nothing. White women are soft. Tali observed, stirring something that smelled of sage and dried meat. Weak, useless in hard land. I'm learning, Eloise managed between gasps. Learning is not enough. Surviving is what matters. Tali's scars pulled tight as she frowned. These marks soldiers gave them with their sabers, while my children burned. Should I trust you because you saved one child? One child when dozens have died? The question hung like smoke from the cooking fire. Eloise looked at this woman who had lost everything yet found strength to keep living, and felt her own troubles shrink by comparison. I don't expect trust, she said finally. But I'm not them. I'm not the ones who hurt you. All whites say that, until they prove otherwise. Chaska appeared beside them, settling by the fire, with careful movements of someone who lived with constant pain. His injured leg stretched out stiffly, and Eloise noticed how he rubbed it unconsciously. She carried 4 buckets on her first day, he said quietly. Many would have quit after 2. Tali snorted. The council thinks you grow soft, Chaska. They say you see yourself in every broken thing. Perhaps I do. His voice held no bitterness, just acceptance. But broken things can still serve if given the chance. As evening fell and the camp settled into nightly routines, Eloise found herself lying on hard ground with only a thin blanket for comfort. Every muscle ached and her hands were raw with blisters. Around her, she could hear quiet conversations of people who belonged here, who had earned their place through blood and sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring another day of proving herself to people with every reason to despise her. But in Chaska's quiet defense, and even Tali's harsh challenges, she sensed something she'd lost in Clearwater, the possibility of redemption. Weeks blurred together in backbreaking labor and small victories. Eloise's hands grew calloused, her back strengthened, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, some suspicion began to soften. The breakthrough came when little Kohana fell gravely ill. The 7-year-old had been playing by stagnant pools when fever took him. Within hours, he was burning with temperature, his small body convulsing, while traditional remedies seemed powerless. Eloise watched his mother Winona hold her writhing son and saw her own mother's face superimposed over the Cheyenne woman's features. Before cholera took her parents, Eloise had spent countless hours helping her mother tend Clearwater's sick. She'd learned things white doctors dismissed as women's nonsense. But that often meant the difference between life and death. Please, she said, approaching Winona carefully. I might be able to help. Winona's eyes were wild with desperation. You have medicine? Knowledge. My mother was a healer. She taught me about fevers, about plants that can break them. Eloise knelt beside the writhing child, noting telltale signs she'd learned to recognize. Willow bark for fever, cool water to bring down temperature. But I need to check the water he drank. Tali translated rapidly, and after hesitation, Winona nodded. Eloise worked through the night, brewing bitter tea from willow bark gathered during water runs, applying cool compresses, carefully monitoring the boy's condition. She also examined the stagnant pools where Kohana had played, finding what she'd suspected telltale green scum of algae poisoning. It's not just fever, she explained to worried parents. He's been poisoned by bad water. The medicine will help, but we need to keep him drinking clean water, small amounts regularly. By dawn, Kohana's fever had broken. He slept peacefully for the first time in 2 days, breathing easy and natural. Winona wept with relief, pressing Eloise's hands between her own. "You saved him," she whispered. "You saved my son." Word of Kohana's recovery spread through camp like wildfire. Suddenly, Eloise found herself included in conversations asked for advice on minor ailments, treated as something more than an unwelcome burden. Even Takota's hostility seemed to diminish, though he still watched her carefully. But the most significant change was in Tali. "You knew the poison water," the scarred woman said one evening as they worked together preparing the meal. "How?" "I've seen it before. Children in Clearwater sometimes got sick the same way from pond water during dry spells." Eloise stirred the stew, inhaling rich scents of sage and prairie onions. "My mother taught me to always check the source." Tali was quiet for a long moment, scarred hands working steadily at grinding corn. "Perhaps all whites are not the same," she said finally. It was the closest thing to acceptance Eloise had received, and she treasured it accordingly. But as her position in camp grew more secure, disturbing news began filtering in from the outside world. Chaska brought reports from contacts among traders and other tribes, each piece more troubling than the last. "Sheriff Trask has been busy," he told the council elders gathered around the evening fire. "He's convinced territorial authorities that Eloise was kidnapped, taken against her will." Eloise felt ice form in her stomach. "But that's not true. I can tell them." "They won't listen," Ayana said flatly. "They see what they want to see, and what they want is an excuse to drive us from lands they covet. The cattle ranchers have been pushing for years," Chaska continued. "Our grazing grounds are among the finest in the territory. Rich grass, good water, natural shelter. A profitable Indian war would solve their problem permanently." The implications settled over the camp like a suffocating blanket. Eloise had brought them exactly what they'd feared: unwanted attention from white authorities with unlimited resources and flexible consciences. "We should return her," Takota suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Trade her for peace." "There will be no peace," Chaska replied firmly. "Not while we hold land they want. Returning her might buy time, but won't stop what's coming." "Then what do you suggest?" Ayana asked. "We prepare for war, and hope when it comes we have allies we can trust." His eyes found Eloise across the fire, and she understood the weight of his words. She'd been given a chance to belong here, to become part of something larger than herself. But that belonging came with a price. When the storm broke, she would have to choose sides, knowing the choice might mean death for people she'd grown to love. 3 days later, a federal delegation arrived under a white flag. Captain Morrison, their leader, was a career soldier whose weathered face suggested he'd seen enough frontier politics to be deeply cynical about both sides. "We're here about Miss Harper," he announced to the assembled council. "Sheriff Trask reports she's being held against her will. I'm authorized to negotiate her release." Ayana gestured for Eloise to come forward. This was her moment of truth, and the choice between the familiar world she'd lost and the uncertain future she was still earning. "I'm not a prisoner," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the camp. "I'm here because I choose to be." Morrison frowned. "Mom, you've been reported as kidnapped. We have federal jurisdiction. Your jurisdiction doesn't extend to my personal choices." Eloise interrupted, confidence growing. "I was cast out by my own people for helping a Cheyenne child escape slavery. These people took me in when I had nowhere else to go. They've shown me more honor than my own family." "Even so, ma'am, there are legal considerations." "Legal considerations." Eloise stepped closer, her blue eyes blazing with the fire that had first led her to defy Clearwater's mob. Are you talking about the law that allows militia groups to kidnap Indian children for slave trade? Or the law that lets cattle ranchers steal tribal lands through fraudulent treaties? Morrison's expression grew troubled. Ma'am, I'm just following orders. Then follow them accurately, Captain. I'm not being held captive. I'm not being coerced. I'm a free white woman making a free choice about where I want to live. Unless you're prepared to argue that white women don't have that right, your business here is finished. The captain studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll report what you've told me, Miss Harper. But I should warn you, there are forces at work here bigger than personal choices. You might want to reconsider your position. As the delegation rode away, trailing dust across the prairie, Eloise felt both triumph and dread. She'd made her choice public and irrevocable, but in doing so, she'd painted a target on everyone who'd shown her kindness. You've burned every bridge now, Chaska observed quietly as they watched the soldiers disappear into the heat shimmer. Good, Eloise replied. Some bridges deserve to burn, but as dust settled and normal camp life resumed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just lit a fuse on a powder keg. The storm was coming, and she had no idea how many innocent people would die because of her principles. The attack came at dawn with the quiet efficiency of men who killed for profit rather than glory. Eloise was returning from her morning water run when she heard the first gunshots echoing across the prairie like distant thunder. She dropped the bucket and ran toward camp, her heart hammering against her ribs. Smoke was already rising from several teepees, and she could hear screaming the high, terrified voices of children, mixing with deeper shouts of warriors calling for weapons and defensive positions. When she crested the small rise overlooking the camp, what she saw made her blood freeze. The attackers weren't soldiers in blue uniforms, but civilians in range clothes, riding hard through the camp while Cheyenne scattered for cover. Leading them, his badge catching the morning sun, was Sheriff Randall Trask, but what stopped her cold was seeing Keme Young. Keme, who'd helped her learn Cheyenne words, who'd shown her which plants were safe to eat, standing by the horse herd, making no move to defend his people. As she watched in growing horror, Keme raised his rifle and fired into the air, a signal that brought Trask's men galloping directly toward him. She's at the sacred spring, Keme called out in broken English, pointing away from camp. The white woman I show you where. The betrayal hit Eloise like a physical blow, but there was no time to process it. Strong hands caught her shoulders, spinning her around. She expected to see one of Trask's men, but instead found herself face to face with Chaska, his shirt torn and bloody. I saw you from the ridge, he said urgently. They're not just hunting you, they're trying to massacre everyone. This is the excuse they needed. Kame betrayed us, Eloise gasped. I know. Fear makes people do terrible things. Chaska's jaw was tight with controlled anger. But we can't help him now. We need to reach the others. They made their way carefully through scattered rocks and sagebrush, staying low and moving when gunfire covered their approach. The camp was chaos, women and children huddled behind overturned wagons, while warriors tried to mount a defense against enemies who seemed to know exactly where to strike. How do they know our position so well? Chaska muttered as they watched Trask's men bypass main defensive positions with practiced ease. The answer came in a flash of terrible understanding. Keme's been feeding them information for weeks, maybe months. Every patrol route, every defensive position, every weakness. But why? Before Eloise could answer, voices approached their hiding spot. Trask's voice specifically, and he was talking to someone in low, urgent tones that carried clearly in the still air. I don't care about your tribal politics, the sheriff was saying. Our deal was simple. Information in exchange for your people's safety when the shooting starts. But if you can't deliver the Harper woman, the whole arrangement falls apart. She is clever, came Keme's voice tight with fear and shame. She must have seen attack coming. But Sheriff, you promised my people would be spared. I promised they'd be safe if you cooperated fully. But if I don't have something concrete to show federal authorities, if I can't prove these savages kidnapped a white woman and did God knows what to her, then my whole case collapses. And when it does, the Army's going to come in here with orders to pacify the region permanently. Every last one of you. Eloise and Chaska exchanged glances of growing understanding. This wasn't about justice or law enforcement. It was about land cattle and the relentless westward push of white settlement. She was just a convenient excuse for something that would have happened anyway. You see now, Chaska whispered. It was never about you being kidnapped. It was about finding a reason to take our land and eliminate the people living on it. But Keme believed him. He thought he was saving his people. And now his people are dying because of that belief. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The Cheyenne were outnumbered and outgunned their traditional weapons, no match for the modern rifles Trask's men carried. Slowly but surely they were being pushed back toward the center of camp, where the women and children huddled in desperate fear. It was then that Eloise saw her chance and her choice. Chaska, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. I have an idea. He looked at her from his position behind a fallen log, his face streaked with powder burns and blood. Whatever you're thinking, don't. He wants me alive. That's his weakness. She pressed the small journal she'd been keeping into his hands. This has everything evidence of his crimes, names of his co-conspirators. Get it to Morrison when this is over. Eloise, no, but she was already moving, scrambling over rocks toward the mouth of the valley where Trask had positioned himself. Behind her, she could hear Chaska shouting her name, hear Tali cursing in 2 languages, but she didn't stop. She emerged from cover with her hands raised, walking slowly toward the line of gunmen. Sheriff Trask, I'm here. Let's end this. The shooting stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Trask stepped out from behind a boulder, his face a mixture of triumph and suspicion. Miss Harper, I was beginning to think you'd chosen to die with your savage friends. I'm choosing to live, she said, still walking toward him. But I have conditions. You're hardly in a position to make conditions. Am I? She stopped just out of his reach, her blue eyes blazing with defiance. You need me alive and cooperative. Dead martyrs don't make good propaganda. Trask's smile was cold as winter. Alive, yes. Cooperative. Well, there are ways to ensure cooperation. Are there? Because I've been thinking about your problem, Sheriff. You've got federal investigators asking questions about a kidnapping that never happened. You've got a cavalry unit that's supposed to be here but isn't. And you've got a camp full of witnesses who know exactly what you've been up to. Not for much longer, but that's where you're wrong. Eloise took another step closer, her voice dropping to a conversational tone. You see, I've been keeping records. Names, dates, conversations. All the evidence anyone would need to prove what you've really been doing out here. Trask's face went pale. You're bluffing. Am I? Tell me, Sheriff, do you remember the conversation you had with Councilman Waters about moving the reservation boundaries? The one where you promised him a cut of the cattle contracts? Because I do. I wrote it down. The sheriff's hand dropped to his gun, but before he could draw, new sounds echoed through the valley. Not more of Trask's men, but something unexpected, the thundering of many hooves approaching from multiple directions and voices calling in what sounded like Cheyenne war cries. But these weren't the voices of the camp's defenders. These were different voices coming from outside the valley. Trask's face went white. That's impossible, my scout said. His words were cut off as the first arrows began falling among his men. Not random shots, but precisely aimed missiles that spoke of coordinated attack by skilled warriors. Within seconds, 3 of his hired guns were down, and the rest were scrambling for cover. The sacred spring. Chaska said with grim satisfaction, having appeared beside Eloise during the confusion. Keme told them you were there, but that's where our allied bands were waiting. His betrayal led them straight into an ambush. What followed was brutal and swift. The reinforcements weren't cavalry or federal troops, but Cheyenne warriors from allied bands who'd been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. They swept through Trask's scattered men like wildfire, through dry grass, showing no mercy to those who'd come to massacre women and children. But even as the battle turned in their favor, Eloise saw something that made her blood run cold. Old Matto, one of the camp's most respected elders, was moving through the chaos with purpose that seemed wrong. Instead of helping defend the camp, he was herding children toward a specific area, an area that would leave them exposed to Trask's remaining gunmen. Chaska, she gasped, pointing toward the elder. Look at Matto. He's leading the children into the open. Chaska finished, his face going gray with understanding. He's been working with Trask, too. The second betrayal hit harder than the first. Matto had been one of the few who'd spoken in favor of accepting Eloise into the camp. He'd shared stories with her, taught her about Cheyenne history, gained her trust completely. And now he was using that trust to deliver the camp's most vulnerable members into enemy hands. Why, Eloise whispered. Because Trask promised him the children would be spared if he cooperated. Chaska said grimly. Just like he promised Kemi. Fear makes people believe anything. Matto had almost reached the killing ground when Tali appeared, her scarred face twisted with rage. The two elders faced each other across 20 feet of open ground, while behind them, children cowered in confusion. Traitor. Tali spat in Cheyenne, her voice carrying clearly across the battlefield. I saved them, Matto replied in the same language. The white sheriff promised. The white sheriff lies. Tali's voice cracked like a whip. As all whites lie, and you believed him. What happened next would haunt Eloise for the rest of her life. Matto, realizing his betrayal had been discovered, made a desperate choice. He pulled a knife and lunged at Tali, perhaps hoping to silence her before she could expose him further. But Tali was faster, her reflexes honed by years of loss and survival. Her own blade found his heart before his could reach her throat. Matto fell without a sound, his blood soaking into the earth he'd tried to protect through betrayal. The children scattered, but they were safe now. Tali had positioned herself between them and danger, just as she'd positioned herself between Eloise and suspicion months ago. The scarred woman's eyes met Eloise's across the battlefield. And something passed between them, understanding, forgiveness, the recognition of choices made in impossible circumstances. Trask himself tried to use the confusion to escape. But Keme, young, shamed Keme, appeared in his path. The young warrior who'd betrayed his people now stood between their enemy and freedom, his rifle trained on the sheriff's chest. No more running, Keme said in broken English. No more lies. You can't shoot me, boy. Trask sneered. I'm a federal officer. Kill me, and the army will come down on this place like the wrath of God. Maybe, Keme replied, but you will still be dead. For a moment, the two men faced each other across the space between betrayal and redemption. Then Trask made his choice, grabbing for his gun with desperate speed. He was fast, but Keme was faster. The young warrior's shot took the sheriff in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the blood-soaked earth. Trask tried to speak, tried to reach for his weapon one more time, but death took him first. The battle was over. The attackers were dead or fled. The camp was secure, and the price had been paid in blood and sorrow. Eloise knelt beside Chaska, who'd taken a bullet in the shoulder during the final moments of fighting. His face was pale with pain, but his eyes were clear. It's finished, he said simply. Is it? Eloise looked around at the destruction, at the bodies of friends and enemies alike. How do we come back from this? The same way we always have, Tali said, appearing beside them with her knife still bloody. We survive. We remember. We choose to be better than those who tried to destroy us. Captain Morrison arrived within hours, having been alerted by the sound of gunfire that carried for miles across the open prairie. He surveyed the scene with the professional eye of a man who'd seen too many such battlefields. But even he seemed shaken by the scope of the carnage. "Sheriff Trask is dead," he announced after examining the body. "Along with most of his men. I'll need full statements from everyone involved." "You'll get them," Ayanna replied, her voice steady despite the losses they'd suffered, along with evidence of his real motives. Eloise produced the journal she'd kept since arriving at the camp. Not just personal observations, but detailed records of conversations she'd overheard, evidence of the broader conspiracy to seize Cheyenne lands for cattle ranching interests. "This has everything," she told Morrison, handing over the leather-bound book. "Names, dates, financial arrangements, enough to expose the entire network." Morrison examined the journal with growing amazement. "Miss Harper, this is comprehensive. Where did you get all this information?" I listened. People tend to ignore women when they're planning their schemes, assuming we're too stupid or too scared to understand what we're hearing. Eloise's smile was sharp as a blade. They were wrong. The legal proceedings that followed made headlines across the territory. With Eloise's evidence and testimony from surviving members of Trask's gang, federal prosecutors were able to expose a conspiracy that reached from local cattle ranchers to territorial politicians. Several prominent citizens found themselves facing federal charges, and the Cheyenne were officially guaranteed protection of their existing lands. But for all the legal victories, the human cost had been severe. 12 Cheyenne had died in the attack, including 3 children. The betrayals by Keme and Maddo had shattered trust within the community, forcing painful conversations about loyalty, fear, and the prices people pay for survival. Keme's redemption came through action rather than words. The young warrior threw himself into the work of rebuilding with desperate intensity, as if constant labor could somehow atone for the blood on his hands. He also voluntarily submitted to the traditional Cheyenne justice system, accepting punishment for his betrayal, even as the community struggled to forgive him. "He will find his way," Chaska told Eloise one evening as they watched Keme working by firelight long after everyone else had gone to sleep. "Guilt can be a teacher if you let it." "And Maddo?" Eloise asked. Maddo chose fear over faith. It cost him everything. Chaska's voice was sad, but not bitter. "We honor the good he did before, but we cannot forget the price of his final choice." The rebuilding took months, but gradually the new camp began to take shape in a different location, deeper in the mountains. Federal troops maintained a protective presence nearby, ensuring that no more Trasks could threaten the Cheyenne with impunity. Eloise found herself serving as an unofficial liaison between the tribe and various government officials, her unique position as a white woman who'd chosen to live among the Cheyenne, making her valuable to both sides. She helped translate not just languages, but cultural concepts, bridging gaps that had led to misunderstanding and bloodshed. It was during one of these diplomatic missions that Captain Morrison approached her with an unexpected proposition. The territorial governor wants to establish a new position, he told her and Chaska as they sat around the evening fire. Someone to serve as permanent liaison between the federal government and the various tribes in the region. Someone who understands both worlds and has the trust of both peoples. Eloise felt her pulse quicken. "You're offering it to us, to both of you, as partners, as..." Morrison paused, seeming to search for the right words. "As husband and wife, if you're willing to make that commitment." The word hung in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. They had been companions, friends, allies, in the struggle to build something new from the ashes of conflict. But marriage was a formal recognition of commitment that carried weight in both cultures. "What would it involve?" Chaska asked. "Travel mostly." visiting reservations, negotiating disputes, preventing the kind of misunderstandings that led to this tragedy. It would be dangerous work, and it would take you away from here for months at a time. Eloise looked at Chaska, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They had already been doing this work informally for months. The question was whether they wanted to make it and their partnership official. "We'll need time to discuss it," Chaska said. "Of course, take all the time you need." After Morrison left Eloise and Chaska walked to their favorite spot overlooking the valley. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "What do you think?" Eloise asked. "I think we've already been doing that job," Chaska replied. "The question is whether we want to make it official. The marriage or the position, both." Eloise looked out across the valley that had become her home, at the teepees and cabins where people she'd come to love were settling in for the night. She thought about the children who would grow up here, the challenges they would face, the bridges they would need to build between worlds that often seemed determined to remain separate. "Yes," she said finally, "to both." The wedding was held during the harvest celebration, when the valley glowed golden with autumn light, and the air smelled of wood smoke and roasting corn. It was a ceremony that blended traditions from both cultures' Cheyenne rituals of commitment and white customs of legal recognition. Ayanna performed the traditional blessing that made them family in the eyes of the tribe, while Captain Morrison served as the federal witness required for legal recognition. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with representatives from multiple tribes joining to witness this unusual union and the hope it represented. But even as they celebrated, Eloise could see the challenges ahead. Their new position would indeed take them away from the valley for months at a time, placing them in the middle of conflicts between peoples who often seemed to speak different languages, even when using the same words. There would be more betrayals, more misunderstandings, more moments when love seemed insufficient to bridge the chasms between worlds. As she stood beside Chaska during the ceremony, her hand in his, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been cast out as a traitor and taken in as a stranger. She had found love in the most unlikely place and discovered that home was not a location, but a choice to belong. The ceremony concluded with a traditional Cheyenne blessing spoken in the old language, but translated for the white guests who had come to witness this unusual union. "May your love be as enduring as the mountains, as flexible as the grass that bends but does not break in the wind. May you find strength in each other when the world seeks to divide you, and may your path be lit by the wisdom that comes from understanding many truths." Their first assignment came sooner than expected. A dispute had erupted between the Lakota and white settlers over water rights, and tensions were escalating toward violence. Eloise and Chaska traveled north in early winter, their wagon loaded with supplies, and their hearts heavy with the responsibility they'd accepted. The negotiations took weeks, complicated by decades of mistrust and competing interests. But gradually, through patient listening and careful mediation, they helped the two sides find common ground. The agreement they brokered wasn't perfect, but it prevented bloodshed and established a framework for future cooperation. "You did well," Chaska told Eloise as they prepared to return home. "You understood what both sides needed, not just what they wanted." "I had a good teacher," she replied, taking his hand. "Someone who showed me that strength comes in many forms." They returned to find the valley transformed by winter's arrival. Snow covered the mountains like a white blanket, and the stream ran clear and cold beneath a thin layer of ice. The community had grown during their absence, as word spread of a place where different peoples could coexist in peace. Among the new arrivals was a group of white settlers who had requested permission to establish a small farming community at the eastern end of the valley. Their leader was a woman named Sarah, who had traveled from Kansas with her 3 children after her husband died in a farming accident. "I heard this was a place where people were judged by their actions rather than their blood," Sarah told the council. "My children and I need a fresh start and were willing to work for it. The council meeting that followed was heated but civil, with valid concerns raised on all sides. Some worried about bringing in too many whites too quickly, while others argued that the valley's strength lay in its diversity. In the end, they agreed to a trial arrangement. The settlers could establish their farms, but they would be subject to Cheyenne law while on tribal land, and any violation of trust would result in immediate expulsion. It was a decision that would be tested repeatedly in the months that followed. The white settlers had to learn new ways of living, while the Cheyenne had to overcome generations of mistrust. There were conflicts, misunderstandings, and moments when the experiment seemed doomed to failure. But gradually, something remarkable began to emerge. The settlers' children played with Cheyenne children, learning each other's languages and customs. The adults found ways to share knowledge, the whites teaching new farming techniques, while the Cheyenne shared their understanding of the land and its rhythms. Eloise watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had been cast out for helping one Cheyenne child, but now she was helping to build a community where such help was natural and expected. "Do you think it will last?" she asked Chaska one evening as they watched the mixed group of children playing by the stream. "Nothing lasts forever," he replied. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that we tried, and for a while, we succeeded." As winter deepened into spring, Eloise discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy and concern in equal measure. Mixed-blood children faced challenges in both worlds, belonging fully to neither while carrying the heritage of both. "What kind of world are we bringing a child into?" she asked Chaska one evening as they sat by their favorite spot overlooking the valley. "A better one than the world we inherited," he replied, his hand resting gently on her growing belly. "Not perfect, but better. Our child will grow up knowing both cultures, speaking both languages, understanding that difference doesn't have to mean division. And if others don't accept that, then our child will help teach them just as you helped teach us." The baby, a daughter they named Hope, was born during the first blizzard of winter, as if determined to enter the world during the season when survival depended most on cooperation and shared warmth. She was beautiful and healthy, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. The celebration of her birth brought together the entire community, both Cheyenne and the white settlers, who had proven themselves worthy of acceptance. As Eloise held her daughter and watched the faces around her, Tali and Kemeayana and the other elders, the white farming families who had become genuine neighbors rather than occupiers, she felt something she had never expected to experience again. She felt like she belonged to a family that spanned cultures and colors, united not by blood, but by choice and commitment to something larger than individual ambition. Years passed. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who switched effortlessly between English and Cheyenne, who learned to plant corn from Tali and to read books from her mother. More mixed marriages occurred, creating a generation of children who saw diversity as natural rather than threatening. The valley became known throughout the territory as a place where different peoples could coexist peacefully. Government officials came to study their methods, writers came to document their experiment, and settlers came seeking the kind of acceptance that was rare on the frontier. Not every attempt at integration succeeded. Some white settlers proved unable to abandon their prejudices, while some Cheyenne remained convinced that any cooperation with whites would lead inevitably to betrayal and loss. But enough succeeded to prove that the experiment was viable. The people of goodwill could find ways to build something new together. The real test came during Hope's 10th year, when a new territorial governor took office with plans to civilize all the Indians in the region. He proposed moving the Cheyenne to a reservation in Oklahoma, claiming their current arrangement was unnatural and contrary to American values. Eloise and Chaska traveled to the territorial capital to fight this proposal, bringing with them a delegation that included both Cheyenne leaders and white settlers from their valley. The hearings were tense and often hostile, with the governor's supporters arguing that Indians and whites could never truly coexist. Look at them, Eloise said during her testimony, gesturing to the mixed group behind her. Look at what we've built together. Children who speak both languages, families that span both cultures, a community that's stronger because of its diversity rather than in spite of it. That's not integration, the governor replied dismissively. That's contamination. White children running wild like savages, Indian children getting ideas above their station. It's not natural. Natural. Eloise's voice rose with the passion that had first led her to defy Clearwater's mob. What's natural about taking children from their families? What's natural about stealing land from people who've lived on it for generations? What's natural about hatred and fear? The hearings continued for weeks, but in the end the delegation prevailed. The federal government, influenced by the success of their experiment and the growing national attention it had received, ruled that the Cheyenne could remain in their valley as long as they continued to demonstrate peaceful coexistence with their white neighbors. It was a victory, but a fragile one. They all knew that political winds could change, that future governors might not be so easily persuaded. The arrangement they'd built was always one election, one crisis, one betrayal away from destruction. But as they returned to their valley and saw their children playing together by the stream, Eloise felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had proven something important, that people of different backgrounds could find ways to live together without losing their essential identities. On her 20th anniversary of arriving in Cheyenne territory, Eloise stood once again by the stream that had become the heart of their community. But this time, she was surrounded by 3 generations, children, parents, and grandparents, representing a dozen different backgrounds and cultures, all bound together by the choice to see past differences to the humanity underneath. Tell us the story again, Grandma Eloise, said one of the children, a boy who was half Cheyenne, quarter white, and quarter Mexican, whose very existence represented the kind of complexity that the old world had found threatening. Which story? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The story of how we all came to be here together. Eloise smiled and began the tale she'd told countless times, but never tired of telling. It was the story of choices made in impossible circumstances, of people who chose hope over fear, understanding over hatred, love over division. The most important thing to remember, she concluded, is that every person who lives here made a choice. We chose to see past differences to the humanity underneath. We chose to build instead of destroy, to include instead of exclude, to trust instead of fear. But what about the bad people? Asked Hope, now a young woman herself and expecting her first child. What about Sheriff Trask and the ones who wanted to hurt us? They made different choices, Eloise replied. They chose fear over hope, hatred over understanding, greed over generosity. And in the end, those choices destroyed them. But they almost destroyed us too, pointed out Marcus, the son of one of the white farming families, now a respected member of the community council. They tried, Eloise acknowledged. But we survived because we had something they didn't have. We had each other. We had people willing to sacrifice for the good of the whole community, people willing to forgive mistakes and give second chances, people willing to build bridges instead of walls. As the children dispersed to their various homes and families, Chaska appeared beside her with the quiet step that had become so familiar over the years. His hair was now completely silver, and his limp had grown more pronounced, but his eyes still held the same calm strength that had first drawn her to him. Still telling stories? He asked with gentle humor. The important ones. The ones that remind us why we're here and what we're trying to build. They walked together through the valley as evening settled around them, past gardens, where traditional Cheyenne plants grew alongside crops from around the world. past workshops where craftsmen of all backgrounds shared their skills, past the school where children learned history that included all their people's contributions. It wasn't paradise. There were still conflicts, still misunderstandings, still moments when old prejudices surfaced and threatened the peace they had built. But it was proof that something better was possible, that people could choose cooperation over conflict if they were willing to do the hard work of understanding each other. Do you ever regret it? Chaska asked as they reached their home, a cabin that had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family and their role as community elders. Regret what? The choice that brought you here. Everything you gave up, everything you lost. Eloise considered this as she looked out over the valley that had become her world. She thought about the life she might have lived in Clearwater, the conventional marriage she might have made, the children she might have raised within the narrow confines of white society's expectations. I didn't lose anything worth keeping, she said finally. I gained everything that matters. Inside their home, Hope was already putting her own children to bed, reading them stories in both English and Cheyenne. Beside her, Kemi, now a respected elder himself, was teaching the older children to carve wooden toys, his hands steady despite the years. The young warrior who had once betrayed his people had spent decades earning their forgiveness and trust. He had never forgotten the price of his fear, but he had learned to transform that memory into wisdom, teaching others about the importance of courage in the face of impossible choices. As Eloise prepared for sleep, she reflected on the words of the Cheyenne blessing spoken at her wedding. May your love be as enduring as the mountains, as flexible as the grass that bends but does not break in the wind. They had bent, she and Chaska and all the people of their valley. They had bent under the pressure of prejudice and violence, under the weight of history and the force of those who wanted them to fail. But they had not broken. They had found ways to flex with the storm while keeping their roots deep in the soil of their shared humanity. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the sense of growing things and the sounds of a community at peace. It was not the ending Eloise could have imagined when she was shoved through the dust by an angry mob cast out for the crime of showing mercy to a frightened child. But it was an ending that proved the most important truth she had learned in her journey from outcast to bridge builder, that love given freely and without reservation had the power to transform not just individual hearts, but entire communities. That courage exercised in service of justice rather than revenge could create something beautiful from the ashes of hatred. And that sometimes the choice to stand with the despised and rejected could lead not to destruction, but to the discovery of a home more real and lasting than anything built on the foundations of exclusion and fear. As sleep claimed, her Eloise's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude, not for an easy life, but for a meaningful one. She had found her place in the world, not by demanding acceptance from those who had rejected her, but by earning it from those who had welcomed her despite having every reason to turn away. In the morning, there would be new challenges, new opportunities to build bridges between divided peoples, new chances to prove that understanding was stronger than hatred. But tonight, in this valley, where different worlds had learned to coexist, all was peace. The flame of redemption burned steady and bright, a beacon of hope in a world that too often chose darkness over light. And in its glow, the future looked brighter than the past had ever dared to promise. The story was complete, but the legacy would endure. In the children who played together, regardless of their parents' origins, in the adults who chose cooperation over conflict, in the community that had proven different peoples could build something beautiful together, the flame would continue to burn, lighting the way for generations yet to come. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, came the sound of children's laughter, the same sound that had once given Eloise hope. In her darkest moment, now multiplied 100-fold as testament to the power of love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and the human capacity to choose light over darkness. The flame of redemption had become a fire that would never die.